Okay. You can continue. Thank you.
So I'm sure a lot of you have heard about the, at least once, about the disputes or conflicts over the use of or non-use of a certain language in the world. For example, in Canada, where I live, there has been some protests on the issues of protecting and respecting indigenous languages. And the collective action, actually actions of indigenous communities, led the government to pass Indigenous Languages Act in 2019. In the US, for example, a Filipino group of Filipino nurses filed a lawsuit against the hospital that banned the use of Tagalog inside a building. So such examples are everywhere, like in the UK or in other parts of Europe, Asia, and Africa. Since languages are important part of sustainability issue, international organizations such as UNESCO and UN have begun to raise awareness of the importance of creating a linguistically inclusive global society. And such movements increasingly pressure organizations to rethink the ways in which to manage different languages and their speakers and how to integrate them into organizational processes. Languages play a crucial role in the creation of inclusion and exclusion because they represent an important criterion for distinguishing us from them. Nevertheless, organizations with multilingual workforce often prefer a lingua franca for efficient communication because the presence of multiple languages are often considered as a barrier for knowledge and information sharing. So reflecting this phenomenon, scholars in the field of management and international business have focused on the use of a single dominant language and its exclusionary effect. So they suggest that an organization's endorsement of a certain language leads to the creation of symmetric power relations between native and non-native speakers. And this, while this recent research has made important contribution to the understanding of exclusionary practices created by lingua franca in organization, little is known about the dynamics surrounding the presence of relatively lower status languages and how organizations become linguistically inclusive over time. And social linguists refer to a dominant language as a high status language or H language, and relatively less dominant language as low status language or L language in multilingual society. So in this paper, I categorize Kazakh as an L language and Russian as a high status language in organizational context. I know that this can provoke heated discussion on status of language, but I'm well aware of the fact that Kazakh is a state language and has a higher status in society, but I'm talking about more in the context of organization and how can I say, but Russian is still even though Kazakh is the state language of Kazakhstan, Russian is still dominantly spoken in different sector, commerce and business, and especially in financial sector. So our research question is, how do organizations become linguistically inclusive? And I believe that this is an important question to answer because multilingualism is becoming a common and an important phenomenon to understand organizational dynamics these days. So our research context is the head office of KC Bank, a pseudonym of a private bank in Almaty and located in Almaty, Kazakhstan, where we observed changing linguistic dynamics of an organization. Kazakhstan inherited a linguistically and culturally Russified population after gaining independence. During the Soviet time, Russian was perceived as a dominant language, a language for elites, language for higher education, while Kazakh was considered more or less as a language for ethnic Kazakhs. Therefore, in 1997, the government announced a new language law to promote the use of Kazakh more broadly. Although the law made Kazakh as the state language, its status was still relatively lower than Russian in workplaces and professional settings, including financial organizations. The head office is located in Almaty, the center of commerce and business of Kazakhstan, and we categorized our interviewees into two groups, Russophone bankers and Kazachophone language workers. So Russophone bankers used only Russian in the work processes until language workers were hired following the new language law in 1997. However, majority of them had at least basic knowledge of Kazakh. Basic means they could at least they knew how to speak hi, how are you? Language workers include not only professional translators, but also Kazachophone secretaries who also supported bankers with their linguistic knowledge by, for example, doing small translation or answering phone calls in Kazakh, in both Kazakh and Russian. Since politics, economics, and society were changing rapidly in Kazakhstan between 1991 and 2015, I deliberately divided my time and conducted 4 rounds field research between 2013 and 2015 during my PhD. And we have 128 interview data, and we also used observation data and documents. So among many banks I visited and I investigated, this one I spent most time. Actually, I spent almost 1 month. I went to the head office, let's say, not every day, but like I tried it like at least four times a week to observe their language use. Our understanding of a process by which KC Bank became linguistically inclusive evolved throughout the 3 main stages of data analysis. And in the first stage, we created timeline by listing major changes related to languages in government policies, society, and KC Bank. And we then developed detailed descriptions of language workers' evolving actions, as well as bankers changing linguistic practices over time. So I had some retrospective interviews. And my also observation all became part of very important data to understand what happened in the past, in the 1990s and early 2000s, mid 2000s, and so on. And the theme in this process, the theme of inclusiveness emerged. And in the second stage, we created thematic summaries. We examined 136 themes and made connections across themes in different categories. And this led us to identify a single chain of 12 main empirical themes. And in the third stage, we visually organize our data, our findings, our theoretical themes to articulate our insights on how the themes are related to one another. So at the end, we identified 3 main mechanisms underlying process towards linguistic inclusiveness, and I will show you the figure later. I'm not going to go through everything, but this is how we analyze our data, how we create thematic summary of changes in linguistic practices in KC Bank. So based on our raw data, we created empirical themes, and we then created thematic themes. So in 1997, when the new language law was introduced, KC Bank faced pressure to adopt Kazakh. So instead of providing language training to existing workers, they decided to hire a small number of Kazakh bilingual, Kazakh-Russian bilingual language workers. was because in the 1990s, Kazakh was perceived as an unnecessary language for organizational operations during the time. So for example, one of the bankers said back in the days when people sent letters to the office for communication, among 100 letters, there were only 3 or 4 written in Kazakh. So it means that their customers did not use the Kazakh language either. And from 1998, language workers helped bankers respond to external pressures while helping maintain the dominance of Russian in internal practices. For example, when the bank received some documents in Kazakh, translators translated them into Russian for internal distribution. And the bankers prepared their responses in Russian, handed back the document to the translation department and so on. So they call it an efficient work process, but to me, it sounds a little bit less efficient. However, from 2000 onwards, the prevailing societal perception of Kazakh, which was probably an old-fashioned and backward language, gradually changed. And it was because of the number of ethnic Kazakh increased due to the out-migration of Slavic groups and in-migration of Kazakh diaspora. It's also because as the result of the government education policies and media promotion. And many Kazakhs began to view speaking Kazakh as a sign of respect for the country. So such demographic and perception changes led the increase in the demand on services in Kazakh. So one of the Kazakhophone informants outside KC Bank actually told me that although Kazakhophones all fluently speak Russian, they would still claim services in Kazakh just to make a point. So alongside this growing public demands, Kazakhophone language workers became important assets, especially for customer-facing activities. And one of the bankers said, as for the service industry, we cannot just ignore the demand. The language was not necessary in the past, but it became important after the millennium. Language workers did not only translate documents, but they also began to involve in like customer-facing activities, such as checking and fixing grammars or errors in the website or ATMs and so on. And they also participated in face-to-face meetings and especially press conferences where Kazakhophone external stakeholders were present. And while they rarely provided like official like translation services during these events, their attendance allowed the company to avoid criticism from external audiences for not knowing the language in the event. So for example, when a journalist asked question, they were ready to answer in Kazakh. This led bankers to recognize the importance of language workers' unique linguistic skill, as well as their social cultural knowledge for business operations. For example, one of the bankers said, having language workers was the best solution for the bank to keep up with the societal change and carry on professional tasks with little disturbance, like investing time on learning the new language. Although the bank gradually increased the use of Kazakh when interacting with external stakeholders, the bankers' linguistic practices inside the organization did not change much during this period. And this made the language workers to believe that bankers did not respect the language and its speakers. And their frustration was reflected in our interview data. For example, one of the translators said, I saw some foreigners like you who easily learn Kazakh, but these people always make excuses. I think they belittle their own roots by themselves, which is very sad. I think some people just do not see the point. So they express their frustration towards Russian speakers, especially Russian-speaking Kazakhs. And This frustration led language workers to, we call it nudge bankers to speak Kazakh. So shaming was one of the ways for them to nudge bankers. For example, when I was sitting with several translators in a room, a Russophone banker came in and started to speak in Russian with one of the translators, and someone said, called the person out and said, "Oh, she speaks Kazakh, so you should not speak Russian here," for example. And the banker immediately apologized to the group and then switched from Russian to Kazakh. Although his Kazakh was not that good, but he must have felt pressure to speak in Kazakh. They also encouraged bankers to learn and practice the language. I heard a conversation, for example, between Kazakhstan secretary and a Russophone banker. When the banker made a mistake in Kazakh, the banker smiled and said, "Oh, we can practice together," and so on. So such an intervention in an informal setting appeared to be an important means to create pressure for bankers to use Kazakh within KC Bank. So in response to the pressures created by language workers and their actions like nudging, bankers began to recognize that speaking Kazakh is a sensitive issue for Kazakh speakers. Therefore, they enacted code switching in informal settings to show their respect towards the Kazakh speaker. So for example, one of the bankers said, "My driver is 60 years old from Shymkent, and I always have to tell them what to do. And what I try to do is speaking Kazakh because speaking Kazakh is my gesture of politeness and respect." Or the other banker said, "Oh, I speak more Kazakh these days because I know that my Kazakh makes my secretary smile." So language workers then appreciated bankers' efforts to use Kazakh and felt more respected by and closer to them. For example, a translator said that she felt closer and stronger bonding to bankers who greeted in Kazakh and at least tried to speak some simple sentences in Kazakh, like, "How are you? Do you want some tea? Thank you." And another person said that she began to feel greater belongingness because they finally felt a respect from the banker, from the Russophone bankers. So to summarize, although Russophone bankers acknowledged the usefulness of Kazakh in business operation, they initially treated societal change separately from internal practices. And for example, bankers provided services in Kazakh through the help of language workers, but they did not want to use Kazakh during the internal work processes. However, the situation was frustrating for Kazakhophone language workers because the importance of Kazakh was growing for the business operations, and the role of language worker became important for the organizational operation, but they still did not feel a strong sense of belonging. And this led them to nudge bankers to use Kazakh through what I called shaming and encouragement. And this in turn made the bankers change their monolingual practices within the organization and interact with language workers in the Kazakh language, even only in the informal setting. It actually influenced language workers' sense of belonging. And our data suggests that language workers played an important part in helping KC Bank move beyond merely using Kazakh to respond to external pressures to establishing an environment where Kazakh was incorporated into everyday language practices as a matter of respect. So without the language workers, probably they would not even think of using Kazakh in work processes because they had, at least the bankers had very strong perception division between these two languages. For example, when they say Russian is a professional language And workplace is for them, it's not, one of the bankers said, this is not a place to practice your language. So you should, language is not a big issue. So without the presence of language workers or Kazakhstan language workers, it would have been very difficult for them to actually think of using the language inside the organization. So our findings suggest that linguistic inclusiveness is enhanced in organizations when the speakers of low status language feel that their unique value and sense of belonging have increased. And this aligns with existing theories of inclusion like gender, which focus on more gender, ethnicity, race, and age, that suggests that organizations become inclusive when employees can fulfill their desire for both uniqueness and belongingness. However, understanding linguistic inclusiveness in organizational context requires a more precise lens. Since anyone can learn a new language with enough time and effort, individuals often face pressure to fit in with the pre-established linguistic environment of the majority. Unlike ethnicity, something that you can't change, but language you can change, you can learn. So they are more or less under pressure to fit in. Also, it's unrealistic to expect that different languages will be spoken equally in work context purely for the purpose of greater inclusiveness. And most importantly, we identify the trade-off between unique value and a sense of belonging with regard to low status language speaking language workers. So to give you an example with our case, Kazakh speakers' sense of belonging might increase when more people in KC Bank become fluent in the Kazakh language. However, if everyone becomes fluent in both Russian and Kazakh speakers' linguistic and social cultural competence will not be considered as unique. So there is a trade-off. And such trade-off makes it difficult for employees from different linguistic backgrounds to fulfill their need for having both unique value and a sense of belonging as low status language speakers. So building on the existing notion of inclusion and considering the unique aspect of languages, we define linguistic inclusiveness in organizational context as a situation in which different languages as well as stakeholders who speak those languages are respected and valued for their contribution to organizational processes, regardless of their language's external and internal status. And our process model reflects this challenge and explains how a small number of L speakers, meaning low status language speakers, experience an increase in their sense of belonging while retaining their unique values. So in this figure, the x-axis shows the level of belongingness and the y-axis shows the level of value in uniqueness. And in this is, I just zoom in for your convenience. And so basically, this is the 3 stages of how organization become linguistically inclusive when an L language is introduced as new additional work language. So in organizations, adopting a high status language is pretty common. Like, for example, a Japanese company introduce English as a main work language and is often perceived as beneficial because the language provides access to various market opportunities, especially in the global market. So when it comes to, however, when it comes to an L language, people might see it as not as beneficial. So however, organizations can face challenges, face pressures to adopt an L language. In our case, the pressure came from the government, but it can be, it can come from other external stakeholders, such as international organizations, communities, or individuals. So hiring language workers is one of the ways organizations can easily address external linguistic pressures. And in this case, as organizations focused on solving immediate issue related to the use of L language, for example, complying with external demands, but has little motivation to fully integrate the language workers' unique value and belongingness remain low. So, however, we found that language workers can enact what we call social linguistic work to change the linguistic dynamics of an organizations. We suggest that social linguistic work is not limited to just formulating words and texts, but it can be also understood as a form of work in a broader sense. For example, individuals' engagement in purposeful, reflexive efforts to affect social reality. So, so something along the line of, in the similar vein of identity work. I'm sure some of you are familiar with the concept of identity work or institutional work. We conceptualize social linguistic work. And since L speakers, low status language speakers, are active human agents, their social linguistic work occurs not only as a result of societal change, but also through their own agency. So we therefore define social linguistic work in organizational context as everyday actions that shape practices surrounding the use of a particular tongue within an organization. Once L speakers are hired, they buffer between H speaking organizational members and L speaking external stakeholders by facilitating communications. Buffering requires extensive linguistic and social cultural competence. And in KC Bank, translators buffered between Russophone bankers and Kazakhstan external stakeholders like customers, government, and so on, by translating official documents and participating in meetings and helping customer-facing operations, activities. And in this context, translators' agency may appear to be less salient because it was part of their job, assigned job. However, in a broader sense, buffering is an action that can be enacted by any employee with certain linguistic and social cultural competences who is willing to maintain or change organizational linguistic dynamics. So, for example, although their main task of Kazakhstan secretaries involved administrative support work, they engaged in a purposeful effort to buffer between Russophone organization or the members and Kazakhstan external stakeholders by, for example, answering phone calls and switching language from Russian to Kazakh based on the caller's preference. In doing so, secretaries contributed to maintaining Russophone Russian-centered work environment and also helped the organization appear to be bilingual. And through this social linguistic work, language workers' unique value became highly appreciated by the bankers. And in the third stage, L speakers buffering help their unique value enhance, but their sense of belonging remains low. When H speakers, high status language speakers, monolingual practices persist. So in this case, L speakers may enact further social linguistic work by nudging H speakers to use an L language, even only in informal settings. And although the term nudging is widely used in public policy and business marketing as a way to manipulate people's opinion, we conceptualize nudging as bottom-up process by which marginalized individuals place subtle pressure that lead to changes in more powerful actors' practices. I mean, the L speakers enactment of nudging as a way to to change internal linguistic dynamics, further illustrate the agentic nature of sociolinguistic work. And H speakers can accommodate this pressure created by L speakers nudging, because L speakers nudging does not necessarily aim to completely change H speakers' linguistic practices from, for example, from monolingual to bilingual. So therefore, it's not threatening, and it's rather a manifestation of the need to gain symbolic recognition. So in fact, H speakers may also see code switching more beneficial in building relationships with L speakers. Some of our informants also said that actually speaking a little bit of Kazakh with language workers, Kazakhstan language worker actually help them smoothen the work processes. So it's for some people using Kazakh was more or less a kind of strategy to build a relationship with L-speaking Kazakh speakers within the bank. So when H speakers accommodate such pressure through bounded, we call it bounded code switching, L speakers' sense of belonging increases because they feel respected and their unique value is appreciated. And we suggest that speaking another group's language through code switching, even when it is bounded to a certain context, has a strong inclusionary effect in organization. So there has been increasing scholarly interest in understanding organizations through the lens of languages. However, scholars largely focus on discourses rather than a language as a tongue. So our knowledge of dynamics surrounding the use of particular tongues within organization is very limited. And this represents an important gap as the language use is involved with many aspects of organizational life, including the creation of inclusion and exclusion. And our case, Kazakhstan case, provide important insights into how organizations can adapt to a changing linguistic environment. And recent studies have begun to pay attention to the use of low status languages in business operations in order to build sustainable relationships between corporations and local communities, like in the context of CSR. However, to our knowledge, the notion of linguistic inclusiveness has not been explored, despite the growing societal demand for an inclusive work environment for different language groups. So by introducing and developing the concept of linguistic inclusiveness, we shift prevailing focus of studies on languages from exclusion to inclusion. And our theorization reveals a potential trade-off between uniqueness, value in uniqueness, and belongingness in the context of linguistic inclusiveness. And our process model addresses this challenge and proposes a way of enhancing L speakers' sense of belonging without compromising their unique value. So we offer theoretical insights into a process towards linguistic inclusiveness, not by only building on existing inclusion theories, but also discovering distinctive mechanisms underpinning the dynamics of linguistic inclusiveness. And our study also contributes to understanding of sociolinguistic work to advance the knowledge of linguistic dynamics in organization, especially by highlighting the agency of L speakers. And our notion of sociolinguistic work encompasses a wide range of actions of individuals who are willing to be able to shape organizational linguistic dynamics. So our notion of sociolinguistic work can be actually applied to other cases. for example, a Francophone engineer's action to change linguistic dynamics in an Anglophone company in Canada can be understood and analyzed with our notion of sociolinguistic work. And actually, I presented this paper at McGill a few weeks ago, and people, most of them brought up the issues of Francophone, Anglophone Canadian situation, because they're in Montreal and they are very aware of this linguistic dynamics. And many of them kind of associated the notion with the situation they face. Finally, we would like to add one more implications for the practices of linguistic inclusiveness by highlighting the notion of cultural sustainability, because recently there has been a big emerging interest among scholars and practitioners in developing culture as the fourth pillar of sustainability, along with the environmental, economic, and social pillars. And the concept of cultural sustainability highlights the need for development in which the perceptions, values, and ways of life of various cultural groups are appreciated and respected. And the advocates suggest that without the inclusion of their voices, different voices from different views of different language groups, cultural groups, existing sustainability model might have limitation in achieving desired goals, outcomes. So since languages construct an important part of culture, understanding the perspectives of different language groups enriches the evolving concept of cultural sustainability. And by exploring the dynamics of how L speakers become appreciated and accommodated by H speakers in organizations using the context of Kazakhstan, our study presents one concrete way of working towards cultural sustainability in practice. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eunjoo.
Yes.
Yeah. Yeah, perfect. Do you want to stop sharing your screen so you can see everybody?
Oops.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you so much. That was very interesting. I'm going to open the floor up for questions. So if you could raise your hand if you have that, or if you could just message me on chat to let me know that you would like to ask a question. If you can't speak in whichever environment you're in, please do put a question in the chat function and I'll read it out. Okay. Questions, comments, friendly criticisms. Yes, Callie, go ahead.
We have from Camilla Roland a question as well on hand raised.
Okay.
Hi, Eunjoo. Thank you. That was really, really interesting and very topical, of course, for Kazakhstan. I was wondering, so what are some of the limitations of maybe what your fieldwork findings are for applying to other organizational settings outside of a bank, for example? I'm just wondering, was there a lot of dynamics that might be difficult to then apply in other settings with their certain hierarchical structures, for example, in a bank, that maybe you wouldn't find the same issues or dynamics of linguistic inclusiveness in, say, a restaurant or a university setting? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question, because that's the reason actually why I wanted to speak with the people who work in the financial sector, because I know that it's the most, maybe some might not agree with me, but I thought that was the most Russified industry. So that's the reason. And of course, there were different dynamics. I found, I also interviewed people from like more Kazachophone area, like education, like universities. They're more Kazakophones, and the dynamic is of course different. When Kazakh is not as, if the relative status is not that different, does it make sense? Russian, the difference in status is not that huge, then the dynamic is of course different. But the reason I chose banks and other like financial institutes, or to see what's really happening when Russian is preferred by majority of the people and Kazakh is just imposed by the government. So, yeah.
Okay, then we have Camilla, go ahead.
Yes, I would like to thank you for a wonderful lecture on linguistic inclusiveness. Now, I myself study inclusiveness, but in educational context. I'm doing my PhD here at the Faculty of Education in Cambridge, and I study inclusive education system development in Central Asia. Now, I have a question regarding the nudging techniques and how controversial they are, and how some of the nudging techniques, such as shaming, might arguably be called rather exclusionary techniques. I remember when I was doing my master's degree and I had internship placement in one of the schools, I'd been speaking to students at high school, and these were students of Kazakh speaking and English speaking classes, so Kazakh speaking and English speaking, Russian speaking departments. And the Russian speakers, several students shared their concerns about them being rather neglected and shamed in comparison to the other classes, which were Kazakh speaking. So whenever there was a city tournament in debate, the Kazakh students were notified, while the Russian class, Russian speaking class, was not notified even of that opportunities. And they shared that they rather felt very demotivated, disempowered, and excluded. And therefore, even though you conceptualize nudging as one of the essential techniques of soft power used to increase inclusiveness, but in my experience, I've seen how many times it's actually interpreted as rather exclusionary practice. So was there any data in your study that expressed that type of concerns, that Russophones felt excluded, they felt less empowered? And how are you dealing with this when you've been conceptualizing such nudging techniques?
That's a really interesting question. I actually know that the notion, the concept of shame has depth, theoretical depth, and it's not the mechanism for change. It's rather because, like in the US, for example, people shame each other wearing masks. They use this kind of tactic to encourage people to wear masks, but in fact, it doesn't work. So shaming is not something that easily make people to change their behavior, of course, but I believe that shame has a range, has different range, and especially shaming, what I'm talking about in what I saw in this particular context was that it was not threatening or to exclude Russophone because they didn't do more than small actions. And also, I think fundamentally, they provoked some feelings of, I don't know, like guilt. That was my observation, like, oh, you don't speak Kazakh, but you're ethnic Kazakh, so maybe you should deal with a little bit of what I'm, my telling off, for example. So yes, definitely. I also saw some Russophones telling me that it's exclusionary in many ways, and especially when the society is changing rapidly towards more bilingual or Kazakh friendly, and I could see that exclusion, the feeling of exclusion emerges by default almost for other end of the group, right? So yeah, that's something that I also address in my thesis, but here, at least in these organizations, I would conceptualize, I would see it as something that rather go for harmony than exclusion. And also maybe because of the relationship between the Kazakhophones and Russophone in my context, because they were bankers and they were maybe the main key workers, whereas language Kazakhophone speakers were support workers. So maybe the dynamic was different. So I'm curious to know more, like in other contexts, like what's gonna happen. And thank you so much for a great question and comment.
Ferdinando, go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much for a very interesting talk. I had a question regarding the incentives towards language inclusiveness. You highlighted how the government law, I think it was in 1997, towards making Kazakh more open and widely spoken was kind of the drive towards language inclusiveness. Do you think would have been the same kind of process if the law weren't there? If it was, say, more of a public-driven process towards inclusiveness of Kazakh language in Kazakhstan, or is it mostly a government-driven process in that sense?
Well, it's hard to tell, hard to predict what would happen if without the government law, but for sure, the dynamics must be different. And especially, I believe that, I mean, this is part of my PhD thesis too, but I really thought that the law was very important to make the whole, lead the whole change, because as you could see, during the time in 1991, the number of Kazakh speakers were much lower than the number of Russian speakers. So without the government intervention, it would have been very difficult. But then I want to argue that yes, the government played a big role in creating the environment for changes, but in fact, it was the individuals and societal members, like communities, individuals, and who it's led by these people. And it's not like just top-down imposition, right? So it kind of the government played a big role in creating the environment, but I would say that it's definitely the language was developed through the different interactions of different people.
Eunjoo, I can come in here a little bit and ask a related question and maybe address something that was, so it's a, I think overall question here is really about incentivization. So I feel that from your talk that you showed very clearly that the people felt incentivized themselves to, and at the same time, it would be interesting to see that within the kind of literature that you're dealing with right now, the kind of studies, is there any specific ways of relating language inclusiveness or inclusive in general to productivity, to other forms of, which go away from people and general idea of being good? Here, what I mean also is that, so in UK, for example, we have for gender equality, you have Athena Swan mechanism. So the organizations which are more, gender inclusive, then they get higher ranking from that, and they have other benefits coming from that within that. So are there any such things that exist? I don't mean necessarily in Kazakhstan. What I really mean here is broadly in literature. Can we find connection between other forms of success which are related to inclusiveness?
You mean linguistic inclusiveness context or general?
Yeah, linguistic inclusive context, yeah.
Yeah, that's a good point. But what we're trying to argue in our paper is how they provide incentive through their own interaction without necessarily the organization or top management provide incentive to learn a language, because it's obviously there's less incentive to adopt low status languages than adopting high status languages, right? For the organization as a whole, but also for individuals. It's better to learn English than, for example, Kazakh. That was also the pervasive perceptions of some Russophones, and I met during the fieldwork. But I think this can be created through individual interactions. For example, they believe that some of them really believe that using Kazakh is beneficial for reputation, internal reputation, or relationship building, because they know that Kazakh people, some Kazakh speakers are sensitive with the language issues, because this is like ongoing discussion since 1990s, right? So then people who are more aware of these issues, they try to speak more in Kazakh, even though their Kazakh is not fluent. And in a way, I wouldn't say that this is for their own interest, but it's also a way of showing respect, like creating some relations with others.
Thank you. Good. Yeah, we can explore that further.
Yeah. Okay. So hold on. We have Timur, Chokan, Pascual, Sertak. Then I have 2 questions from Carlo, and then Felix just raised his hand. So.
And Pascual's hand went down by mistake, so he was.
Oh, okay. So
ahead of
Pascual then
others.
is first, and then Timur and Chokan. Pascual, go ahead.
Hi, Eunjoo. Thank you so much for your presentation. It was very interesting. I just have 2 questions. One is obviously within the context of Kazakhstan, right? So like Kazakh and Russian are like the 2 main languages, but it is a country of many languages, right? And your model, it's based on like an H and an L language. So I'm just kind of wondering if you threw like another language into the mix, how would that potentially change the dynamics that you see and like how inclusiveness comes about. And I'm just thinking here, like, let's say that the L language was perhaps some other language spoken in Kazakhstan, like, I don't know, like Ukrainian or something, right? That perhaps has like a bigger gap in how their perceived utility in the workplace is perceived. Would that also perhaps change like how external pressures and also the agency of the workers in that given workspace like change how inclusiveness would come about?
Well, yeah, that's something that I should also think about, because I've been focusing on the dynamics between Russian and Kazakh, because of this. It's controversial state. I would say it's controversial because in society and politics, Kazakh has actually higher status, and Russian is not relatively lower, and in organizational context it's a bit different. That's why I focused on this 2. But yes, it will be very interesting if I could look at other languages and how it changes the dynamic. I can only imagine, but that's something I can consider for my future research, I guess. But in terms of inclusion, I would say Kazakh is already kind of, it's on the way. I wouldn't say that it's still perfect, because many people are still, this KC Bank do not hire monolingual Kazachophone speakers, so it's on the way. So maybe in the future they will be, they will have different dynamics in terms of other language groups. They will be even more inclusive. I don't know.
Just to jump in, and one of Carlos' questions might be relevant here. He asks, in which ways, if any, the Kazakh Assembly of People representing various ethnic minorities contributes to enhancing linguistic inclusiveness in organizations? Would you be able to comment on that? In that context, if you add more languages to the mix, and if the Kazakh Assembly of People has any?
No, actually, no. I don't know about this.
I'll answer it for Eunjoo. No, so the role of assembly is a bit different. It's more about not Kazakh. It's about representing all other kinds of languages that, or cultures and so on. So I think it doesn't.
No, I think his question is that, so if you add it to what Pascual asked, that if there are more languages, then will there be a multiple language inclusiveness in an organization because of that? Or
yeah, so the point, so she will have to do field work,
right,
and put that in the model to get an answer.
Sure. Yeah. Okay. All right, Timur, then Chokan, then Sertak, and then Felix.
First of all, thank you very much. It's really a very good talk, and clearly a thought-provoking one, since there are so many comments. Very briefly, before I forget, before I move on to my question, just a quick comment on the multiple different languages. I'm from Uzbekistan, and I'm specifically from Bukhara, where we speak Russian, Uzbek, and Tajik. So to me, at least, I'm not a linguist. I'm not a I actually don't have a proper classical training, in that, but just from my perception as a person who is in such an environment, I think what's important to understand is that language is then part of the identity. It's a part of how we identify ourselves. So the language you speak usually implies that you belong to a certain ethnicity or ethnic group. However, that is not always strictly the same thing if you speak more than one language or live in a place which is multilingual, because you are equally fluent, or you can, how do I identify myself as Bukharan? Am I Uzbek or am I Tajik because I speak Tajik and I speak Uzbek? It's just because somebody is preferring to speak Uzbek over Tajik, it doesn't mean that they are trying to suppress a part of me and respect the other part of me. That question just simply doesn't make sense. The other thing to kind of bear in mind is that, at least for Uzbekistan, I'm not going to speak about Kazakhstan, but for Uzbekistan, the two formal languages, i.e. the languages in which legal paperwork can be undertaken, are Russian and Uzbek. So while Tajik is spoken and while Tajik is recognized as an ethnic minority language in Uzbekistan, and there are schools and education in Tajik, the legal paperwork in Tajik is not actually accepted by the most of the places, and that's basis of legal law. Just because a certain language is spoken, it doesn't necessarily mean that it becomes a part of the actual organizational paperwork bureaucracy part. So that's, in that respect, it makes no sense that to include any other language in that regard, simply because that invalidates the whole point of paperwork. But coming back to the point that I made about the language being part of your identity and culture, in Uzbekistan, when a similar process happened with the Uzbek becoming a much more prevalent language, it was, at least in my opinion, I kind of was just living through those times, and I don't know, I may have a very, very narrow view of that thing from the kind of receiving end of it. But I felt that it was driven more by the appearance of local radio and TV shows. And the radio filled a very nice gap, which existed there, giant gap. They started giving a very nice talk shows with a lot of hosts, with a lot of different programs. They played music, did just the usual radio thing. But then you actually heard, I at least heard for the first time, Uzbek spoken in a very cool way. I.e., it was very high Uzbek, it was very grammatically correct, it was beautiful, the voices of people were very nice and pleasant, and the whole thing made speaking Uzbek and the very sound of Uzbek so much cooler. So that's why a lot of people started imitating those radio talk shows, and I could see a very big shift in the way the Uzbek was spoken, for example, in Bukhara, which has a very distinct accent and dialect. I still have very much Bukharan accent when I'm speaking in Uzbek. But we started using more of the high Uzbek phrases, if you like, and the ways of constructing sentences generally. And that, I felt, was the influence of the cultural part of that. So my question to Eunjoo now is, when you were doing your fieldwork, how did you feel the so-called cultural elites, like the radio, TV, the media, newspapers, how did they, what role did they play in this bilingual thing? Because from my experience in Uzbekistan, the sort of the cultural elites still prefer to speak Russian as a sign of them being educated in Soviet times, and that being more elite and more of a preferred kind of persona, if you like. Thank you.
Thank you so much for amazing comments. And yeah, so my own experience was probably Kazakh people from Kazakhstan would have different opinions, but as a foreigner, spent some time in Kazakhstan, I felt that definitely there was a big movement, especially during the time in 2005 and 6. I lived in Almaty for 2 years, and that was the peak of the whole national kind of identity building with the Kazakh language kind of moment, I think, because you could see more TV and programs in Kazakh language during the time, but still, I would say still Russian was dominantly shown on the TV, but still there were different types of programs I could watch, because during the time my Russian was like so bad I could only watch Kazakh TV. So I had to watch Kazakh TV in a way. And I was actually, it's interesting because I was part of their movement maybe, because I was the first official exchange student who came to Kazakhstan to learn Kazakh from South Korea, because there were many students there were students coming from South Korea, but to learn Russian because it was cheaper maybe, or they wanted to try something new. But I was officially the first one from South Korea who studied Kazakh. And that's why I was on many different TVs like Almaty News, or during the time like I was on the TV and I gave interview, and even I was at the presidential election campaign and speaking in Kazakh, something like that. So I could see that obviously they have strong interest in promoting the language. I'm not sure whether they really believed in that, but at least it worked. I believe that the whole, because when I went back to Kazakhstan in 2013, I was very surprised by the changes. So I had no problem speaking in Kazakh on the street. Before, in 2005 and 6, I had to speak some Russian. So the first thing I learned was Russian. How much is it? You know, can you give me some discount or something like that? So I had to learn Russian immediately. But in 2013, 14, 15, I really saw a big difference. So I would say, yes, there was very strong movement, and especially 2007 was the year of Kazakh language, right? So they were really motivated to promote the language, and I would say it worked really well. And it's still on the way, like it's still in the process of becoming more or less, you know, bilingual. And the policy, Carlo mentioned about the Latinization. I'm curious to know what's gonna happen after, because I can see even from Instagram that people share their opinions in Kazakh, in Latin. And to me, it's very weird because I'm not very familiar with the Latin alphabet, speaking in you know, writing in Kazakh. So I'm very excited to see how this has impact on language change or changes in linguistic dynamics at the societal level, as well as the organizational level. So, yeah.
Just to add to what Timur was saying about identity and language, it's quite interesting. In Europe, and the beginning of the nation state is quite closely tied with language, while in the Eurasian space, it's not determined only by language. So like you said, you can be speaking multiple languages, and that does not necessarily mean that your identity is connected completely with one particular language. So I think there is some room there to think about Eurasia and Europe and sort of different models of how we use languages. In India, we'd have a similar conversation. Chokan, go ahead.
Hi. Eunjoo, hi. It's so wonderful to see you presenting again. And thank you very much for such an informative and important topic, really. For me, as being Kazakhstani and being here for some time, it's interesting to see what you already mentioned about. It's the dynamic of the widespreading of the Kazakh usage of the Kazakh language in the daily life and the political life everywhere. So you would see that the dynamic is still there, which you witnessed from 2000 and something to 2015, and now it's the same speed and the same impressive change. However, my first question is, and it's important for you to come again here. My first question is when do you plan to come after the pandemic? After the pandemic, I believe in a year or so anyway, if you have such plans, because it's so important such a topic to be explored from outside, because inside it's so sensitive and so politicized and so emotional that everyone who researches on it, it would immediately fall into a trap of a personal prejudice or a personal side, or it's so people can't accept it nonchalantly or discuss it in an academic way, because it's involved and includes everyone. And I'm not an exception, because I can only greet the growth of my anat in the Kazakh mother tongue, their own language, spreading. But what I can clearly can see, it's the colossal deterioration of the quality of both languages, Russian and Kazakh. Possibly it's connected to the disappearance of academia in a general sense, or deterioration of academia in the Kazakh environment. Possibly not. Maybe something else. But it's without doubt the quality of the language is really, from being a first world country in terms of education and science, and you can still hear elder generation speaking in both languages, in a beautiful language which you want to follow, you want to talk like them, you want to be part of it. And when you hear on TV today or reading newspapers, it's terrible. I have no, my first degree was in journalism, and it was linguistic, and I'm appalled by what is happening, and I don't know what can be done. And my second question is, do you have any intention to research this kind of area of the quality or development of the language quality-wise? Thank you.
Thank you so much. To answer your first question, I was actually planning to go to Kazakhstan next year,
Yeah.
but yeah, it's not gonna happen, I guess. And also, it's very far from Canada, so that's why it's just impossible. It's just I have to go to London first and change, and it's so expensive. So, but yes, I will.
Yep.
I would love to go back because it's been already 5 years since I last visited Almaty, Astana, and Shymkent. So I'd love to go back. The quality of that made me think of the, I heard from different people, especially like Kazakh speakers and language workers, what I call language workers. They also said that the problem of deterioration of the quality of languages over time. And on top of that, this made me think of like trilingualism that the government is promoting. I'm not sure how it's going, but they had a big goal, very ambitious goal, to make citizens speaking 3 languages. And then that really concerned me about the quality of especially Kazakh language, because many young people want to learn English these days, and I'm not sure how this lead to the quality of Kazakh language. Yes, in the future, yes, I would love to see. That's a good point. What you said is really interesting, because it's not only about how many people speak the language anymore. It's a question of how they speak the language, right? So, yeah, that's something that I would love to explore in the future. But first, I really want to go to Kazakhstan.
Come, please come. We miss you.
Come in here and just raise an additional point within the same direction, that the 2 things we have to be careful when analyzing this kind of a thing. One is what we call quality of language. It's a very often a generational issue. So what a generation believes is good language, or what they're used to, and it's a very linguistic topic as opposed to development topic. You need different kind of expertise to perhaps deal with that. Otherwise, it's becomes a hearsay that you will talk to a number of people, different generations, and each will believe they're talking about a stagnant language or a dynamic language, how it includes things. They're very interesting books about other languages, particularly Turkish and Arabic, in both how they were modernized and how language academies were set to do that, and what is, and what outcome of that. So it's a fascinating topic, but one has to keep in mind, always put it, query a little bit more when we say what is the quality of language. And then kind of reiterating in a different way what both Prajakti and Chokan said, it's very important on the other side is to always be clear that language doesn't become a zero-sum game. I think this is what Timur was also saying. Having broader linguistic ability is multilinguality is a value that we have, and so Kazakh expense of Russian versus Kazakh and Russian expense of English. These become very easy things to talk about, and they get and they have a very strong meaning because they go into education policy and how the provision is made for certain kind of schools, curriculum, teachers, and others. And so that commentary has to be always put in front. That is about gaining skills, not losing or dropping a skill that you already have. So that's why I very much agree with what Jokan and Timur were saying, that but you should not drop something you already did very well to do something which is more modern. And that that subjectivity really I think it's difficult to catch in research. It's a very ethnographic perspective to take. You can't model it, but it needs to be always said. So
I think added to the modernity bit, there's also the elephant in the room, nationalism, which portrays a specific language as the language of the nation. And then that becomes complicated, which is why the Eurasian model needs to be brought in. That it is the multilingual range of languages and emotions that we have to actually talk about. Sertak, you've been waiting for a very long time, please.
Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. Based on my observations in Kazakhstan when I was working there as a senior business leader in the noughties in the first decade of the 2000s, I decided to do a PhD on the managerial aspects of this language dynamics. But now that I have seen Eunjoo, she has done a wonderful job, and that takes the burden off my shoulders. So I'll park that. I just wanted to share with you some observations from those years, from a very much a Western company environment. So the first one, I just want to work on this, say a few things on this quality of the language. And I have nothing to do with linguistics, so I might say crazy things. But language changes. And in crazy times, it changes crazily. And Kazakh language is going through absolutely crazy times. That for the first time ever, it is being tested with fire. It is becoming a language of science in a moderate way, language of business, and so on. So I guess to the chagrin of the language purists, they are in for a disappointment because the language will change hugely. And I will quote a very funny example that I found hilarious. I think the newspaper still exists in Kazakhstan, in Kazakh language. Its name is Yegemen Kazakhstan.
Yeah.
It does exist, right? So Kazakh language inevitably is importing so many words from Turkish. And Yegemen means sovereign, right? So Yegemen it's basically a direct import from Turkish. And the word itself was basically coined by the Turkish language revolutionaries in 1930s. And when they were coming up with these new terms, they would look at a French term for school. It would be école, right? And they would just come up with a word, okul, in Turkish, right? This was the depth of their imagination, I guess. So another word from the West English, I guess, I assume, hegemon, it is spelled in a certain way. They would look at it, and instead of hegemon, and this is a very well written history of that word. They took the word from there, made it egemen, and then the Kazakhs took it from Turkish. So the old hegemon became yegemen, and then Kazakhstan, and a lot more of this will come in, right? So that's inevitable. So the next point I wanted to make is, so I speak both Kazakh and Russian, and I suffered so much when I was learning Russian, that if a Russian would suffer as much learning Kazakh, that's a problem. So it is not like a Spaniard learning Catalan in Spain out of respect, etc., for the Catalonian people, right?
Sartaj, I think you have feedback from your
Yeah.
sound somehow.
I'm not sure whether I can stop it. Is it unbearable or?
It's okay, no,
It's
continue.
okay. You finish your point and then we can. Yeah.
Okay.
Go ahead.
So it is more like a Spaniard trying to learn Basque language in Bilbao, right? And I can tell you it never happens. It is a highly exceptional situation, right? So my heart goes to Russian speakers. The third observation is that I still do not have an explanation for this, but I would get these CVs from ethnic Kazakh people, and they would say fluent Russian, fluent English, Kazakh native. And they would come, and I would start the interview with a Kazakh entry sentence. And they would just stop. They would close their mouths and just look at me. So a lot of them didn't speak Kazakh at all. A lot of them. So that was interesting. They would put it in the CV, but not speak. And I'll conclude with some observations on the impact of the Western companies who came to Kazakhstan for major investments. They were good places to work at. They were good paymasters, etc. Now, a lot of them hired Turkish individuals like me at senior positions. Now, all of a sudden, there was us who all learned Kazakh in a month or two, who didn't speak Russian at all, as the senior guy who speaks Kazakh and English, but not Russian. That led to a cognitive dissonance in that environment, because all these very experienced Russian people, age 50s, 40s, certainly 60s, excellent professionals who did not speak English. So all of a sudden there was a barrier between us and them. Bringing in a translator was always the option, but it made it so much more stunted. Whereas a very low-level employee who could speak only Kazakh was able to talk to us without that barrier. It was like, man, what's going on? The second observation was the contribution of the Turkish lycées. There were about 20 of them in Kazakhstan at their heydays. I don't think they exist anymore. And they taught all 4 languages, and they were the most sought after. It was almost like high achievers lycées there.
Sartaj, may I interrupt you? I think you will have an overload for Eunjoo to answer. Okay. Maybe let her respond and we can come back.
No problem. That's it. I think I conveyed the bulk of it. Thank you very much, everyone, for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, it's definitely this language. First of all, the topic of language dynamics in organization. This is very underexplored area, surprisingly. And so, I mean, as a person who wrote PhD drawing upon the social linguistics and linguistic anthropology, I was very surprised to see that how little is explored in the context of organization. Although, as Sertak said, so many different examples of how language creates different dynamics in organization. Like it's really less underexplored. And yeah, thank you so much for sharing your experience. It was very interesting. I would like to know more. I would like to hear more later if you have a chance.
Okay, Carlo had a question and then I'll give the floor to Felix. So Carlo's question was, how do you think the ongoing process of Kazakh alphabet Latinization will impact linguistic inclusiveness in organizations? Yeah, so I saw that earlier. So I mentioned briefly about, I basically said, I don't know. But yeah, I'm very excited to see how this will change
the dynamics, because definitely it's a big change, right? For, I'm sure many people who actually face the challenge of using new letter. Maybe Shokan would agree. I don't know. I mean, it's a hard for me to predict how it can influence linguistic dynamics, but that's very interesting thing to explore for sure. And I am personally interested to know like what's gonna happen.
Monty, you're muted. You're muted still.
I'm still muted.
No, Monty.
Okay, I'm back. Yeah, no, I was telling a very funny story. Partly Chokan was involved in this story. When several of these decrees were made, in actually the story happened in Uzbekistan as well as in Kazakhstan, and we were contacted by a number of people, including embassy and media, as foreign experts. What do we think about it and whatever? And out of curiosity, I said, could I see the decrees? And so it turned out that in all cases, including Uzbekistan, and Chokan managed to get this for me from Kazakhstan, the president or the minister making the decree about Latinization could not read anything in Latin, and so it was in Cyrillic every single time. I have those papers somewhere still. So these are very, very interesting. It's been very interesting to find out that how they were convinced to make this, what set of arguments, when they themselves had absolutely no knowledge of that. And this I think partly connects to what Sartaj was saying as well, that we experience this very often. This is a reality that people will write, they can speak Kazakh or whatever other language in the region because it's required by law or whatever, they should know it. And they are very confident that there are no other speakers like themselves. They know a few words, and they're absolutely shocked by if someone starts to speak to them in that language. And we have literally every single trip we have to the region, we'll always have a very proud parent who will do the reverse thing, who will bring the child, put in front of you. They said she or he speaks fantastic English, and the child will be staring at your face, not knowing what to do. And parent who does not himself or herself know any English, I don't know how they judge that the kid speaks brilliant English, and this cycle continues. So yeah, it's there's a lighter side of the story as well. Anyway, Felix.
Okay, Felix, yes, you've been waiting very patiently. Go ahead.
No, don't worry. I just wanted to say first of all, thank you. And the discussion has been fantastic as well. But the lecture was really, really interesting, and I think the research has some really fascinating conclusions as well. To be honest, most of my questions about the study have been kind of addressed from various angles in the discussion, and it's been really good to hear everyone's perspectives. So I guess I would switch and ask a bit more about your personal experience. You were mentioning about that, you've noticed that change with the kind of ease of speaking Kazakh in those kind of informal situations. And I noticed you also said that in KC Bank as well, there was that emerging culture of kind of informal conversations in Kazakh, but then more kind of formal work going on in Russian. And I'm interested in how, of course, it's very hard to make kind of any kind of predictions or projections on this, but I'm interested in what you think the role of that kind of code switching is likely to play in that linguistic inclusion, and whether it's, this process is coming about more by people feeling comfortable in these kind of Kazakh conversational contexts, but whether that can actually be translated to a broader shift towards Kazakh. I'm just kind of interested in how that code switching might almost muddy the waters in a way, that more people are kind of learning Kazakh in that conversational context, but it's not necessarily translating to a greater, more cultural understanding of
Exactly.
Kazakh. So yeah, just interested in your perspective on that.
Thank you very much. Yes, absolutely. The code switching, I think that's the center of my argument, that it's not about Russophone. I'm not arguing that the Russophone bankers have now, they are turning into bilingual and they take lessons, private lessons, to just communicate with for example, Kazakhphone language worker, because it's as we discussed earlier, it doesn't give them anything more than maybe good reputation, good relationship with the, but then why do they still do that? Is because it's enough to make the relationship better. If you only speak, even like only in informal settings, even like very bounded code switching, like just saying something in simple sentence in Kazakh actually influenced the language workers feel more included, and they made it made them feel more respected, and this led them to feel greater sense of belongingness within the organization. So also is because they didn't create that much big of pressure for the bankers to fully understand our culture or our language. It's like the both sides were, in a way, they try to find the balance between I don't know, like is less conflict, but more in a way harmony, like creating harmony, I would say. So nobody was like crossing the line. Maybe they were shaming to a certain degree or nudging to a certain extent, but they didn't expect any, like, for example, the language workers' actions, what I call social linguistic work, is genuinely about the recognition. My paper, like when you read the paper, I discuss a lot on this, how the mechanisms of why this code switching works influence for positive, create the positive outcomes in terms of like inclusion, but it's about symbolic recognition, and the bankers do a symbolic gesture, show their symbolic gestures to, and code switching is the way, the mechanism they show their symbolic gesture to be polite. So,
okay, Kelly, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, thank you. I've just had so many questions. It's such a fascinating topic. But I guess kind of going back to one of Montu's earlier questions about the kind of so-called productivity measures of language inclusiveness. And obviously these things aren't always cross-culturally relevant, but in some settings where you have governments taking very strong policy stances about bringing in indigenous languages, looking at cases like New Zealand, or how there's, I think there was one case in New Zealand where by using the Maori language specifically and looking at the terms for how they conceptualize things, certain mental health things like autism, they've actually reached different outcomes by being able to speak, and they actually conceptualize it more in, they call it in her space or in his space. And from that, there have been clear medical outcomes from this. Or in Scandinavian countries, there have been a lot of biodiversity conservation outcomes and improvements, arguably, because a lot of the management practices have been conceptualized first through Uralic languages. So it might be a bit early in the stage, or in the case for Kazakhstan or maybe elsewhere in Eurasia, but do we have any of these clear success stories of how Kazakh has been used in modern times for certain outcomes that kind of get us beyond this like metric approach of looking at, okay, we have this inclusive metric here to say, okay, we have this number, but like, what are the qualitative outcomes maybe, if we have them, or it might be too soon?
yeah, I would say, I don't know whether, I cannot say that I found one very strong example that explains the great success of, let's say, the introduction of Kazakh, or even like inclusion wise. Like, I haven't reached that point because still my data is very limited, and I want to really do follow-up interviews with the people. But I mean, it was it was collected in the 2015, and I addressed the limitation that I couldn't really see what you said. Like, that would be very clear kind of indication that why, like, so what question to my paper, like, so what, how did it change? Did we see something big change, and something, that would be very good if I could provide that case. But interestingly, I'm very motivated to explore this topic further, and what you just said about the New Zealand case is very interesting because I'm also, I mean, this is slightly different context, but I'm interested to know how you know, there are many Western mining companies operating in Central Asia in general, and I wanted to explore more of the language dynamics in CSR. So the language dynamics between Western companies. So there must be, it could be English or French, Western languages and Russian and local languages. So I would love to see explore this kind of cases where maybe that will be more concrete. They will show more concrete kind of outcomes of how this works and how it can be it can contribute to something better. So yeah.
So if nobody else has a burning question immediately, then I'll butt in and say something. I don't see any hands up. I don't see any movement of any faces, so I'll just go ahead. The conversation is fascinating, of course, and I enjoyed reading your thesis, and I enjoy listening to how it's progressed further. I guess my question is, since I look at I'm a historian, I look at the Mongol Empire, for those of you who don't know, but I'm also thinking about the nomads and the Eurasian steppe tradition in the nation state and the construction of it. And I wonder if the way we're talking about language and identity, and Timur brought this up earlier, it's very limited to how a monolingual culture looks at anything. In the Indian space, that happened after 1947, after independence, and we see the same thing happening after 1991 in Kazakhstan. Some of it is helped by the state because the state needs to create itself in a very specific nation-state understanding, which is in many cases in Asia has been borrowed, because that's the only way the European vision of a nation-state works, and so we tend to mirror it, and in that sense language becomes very important, territory becomes very important, and then we forget that we've had centuries of interactions where you speak many languages. So for example, I speak Hindi for food, but I speak in English for academic purposes or other reasons. So there is a distinction between which language you use for what reason. It's not prioritizing one over the other. It's simply, that's what comes naturally to me. But in the space of, so now when nationalism then gets entangled with modernization, then specific languages are prioritized, but that is still in a very monolingual culture that happens. English did have that impact in India, and it continues to have that. And I would agree with what Chokan said. I also feel that English has deteriorated. When more people have started speaking English in India, it's deteriorated in quality, but then it goes back to what Monty talked about, like how do we decide what quality of a language is anyway? And now there is Hinglish, English with a lot of Hindi words and how Indians use certain words. But basically, I guess my comment and my question is, how can we accommodate a more natural multilingual approach to this? So I agree with you that it creates inclusivity. So when I go to India, I definitely speak in Hindi in a lot of spaces, even when it doesn't come naturally to me, because I know that the other person will feel more comfortable with it, or they are more, for them, it is more natural to speak in that language. Of course, Kazakhstan is a different ballgame because there was a different language policy before 1991, and then that changed. But if we try to think of Kazakhstan only in a nation state, sort of Kazakh is Kazakhstani, and in order to be Kazakhstani, you must be Kazakh and you must not speak Russian. That's where I think when you explain that, even in management terms, you need to think about that. Like you said, it's more informal. You want to be included, and so it's very nice that the Russian banker or whoever is talking to you in Kazakh. But he doesn't have to have the full gamut of the language for you to feel comfortable in that. So I mean, those are different things to think about in the Eurasian landscape when you theorize. It's not only one language over another, like in your thesis, we all decided together that in the Kazakh landscape, it's more important to add languages than to reduce the number of languages, So. I don't know if you want to comment to any of that stuff.
No, I mean, that's really the, actually, that's related to another issue I'm having these days is whether we should call it as L status or H status languages, because I explained in the beginning, because I didn't want to get the same criticism that I've been receiving from different groups, because the term status is very kind of, it's kind of associated with power. And as you said, in India, like speaking different languages doesn't mean that I have, you know, speaking Hindi has more powerful than speaking other languages, right? So sometimes languages do not have status, but also have different role maybe. So that's something that I would like to kind of explore further, because I have another deadline to resubmit this paper. I have like 3 months left. So that's the biggest kind of issue, that how we phrase these and how we kind of reduce the kind of the implication of power here. But then in-group, out-group dynamics is also a bit unclear. So we're still developing the idea. So what you just told me made me think of how I should really, you know, the direction of my thinking process, because it's about adding more languages, and that's what the government is aiming at. It's not about like eliminating Russian completely or other languages. In fact, they spend more fundings to different languages other than Kazakh and Russian, so for their development of, for example, Uzbek, even Koreans in Kazakhstan. So that's something that I should always remember in terms of explaining this kind of dynamics in Kazakhstan. So it's not very simple. And I'm aware that by dividing languages into two, like high status and low status, is a problem. Is a problem because it's very how do you say, like it's very bipolar in a way. So what you said actually was very helpful to make me think how I should.
I think they're still valid though. I think it's important to, especially in description of how the evolution of language is happening, you have to talk about the high status and the low status, because I think that was part of the problem in the Soviet period. But I think following that, we need to have a language where we can say that it's not about status, it's about belonging and knowledge and all sorts of other cultural aspects rather than just that.
Yeah, I would say that it's an interesting thing in a number of ways. There are two things just to reiterate. One is that the space, the Eurasian space, the Kazakh, Uzbek, Central Asian space is essentially a multilingual space. It is not a bilingual or monolingual space. That is something is the underlying thing. However, historically, there have always been some language which has a high status. It's not only Russian. It was Persian once, it was Arabic even at one point. Within the Turkic language space, some languages have been more predominant in the past than others because of specific literature or poets or whatever, you know, they take high form. And there's always been debate among Turkologists regarding whether the Oghuz, the Eastern Turkic, Western Turkic ones with, you know, the ones with, and there is that other aspect which I think alluded to, the nomadic Turkic language, the sedentary Turkic languages. So those which have a bigger written literature would then be higher, you know, seen as higher. So this has been going on forever. So I don't think you need to worry so much that you're taking a time slice and looking at what has happened at this particular stage. So you can use the model that you're using without, as long as you do offer a little bit of explanation that this is a very dynamic space. However, there are times when languages get constrained, but then they reclaim. So I think we are in a moment of reclaim. I would say regardless of quality, various other issues, Kazakhstan is becoming more multilingual, which is more natural for it. It's in general thing. And again, we look at a very Western perspective, and you were very right to point out that the number of, I sent to some of our group yesterday, you know, the out migration from Kazakhstan that's taking place at the moment. But it's not just out migration, it's where people migrate to, they connect back to Kazakhstan from wherever they are. So particularly Korea is an important one which comes up. And we should not at all forget China. A number of Kazakhs learning Chinese is growing, and a number of Chinese. So Kazakhs are going to China to learn Chinese, and there are Chinese provision being made in Kazakhstan. So we have a whole of that space happening. You know, we should not at all limit English, Russian, Kazakh story. It's going to be much wider. So some of the questions, that's why they were important. But you don't necessarily have to look at multilingual modeling, because you're looking at an institution which was actually bilingual. Mm-hmm. So that's if you define that, you're okay, I think, with the paper.
Yeah, just to add on what you said, I was thinking that although the term H and L status languages receive some criticism for being exclusionary by itself, because some people said that, but then at the same time, the dynamics is different when English is introduced to an organization and when Kazakh is introduced. So definitely, like, there is a big clear difference between when H language is introduced and when L language is introduced. So that's what I wanted to show, kind of theorize and present to the audiences in management. So, yeah.
I think you would also, something that we've been discussing since your PhD, it would be very, very useful to make it clear that why Kazakh case is particularly interesting and particularly special. Mm-hmm. And I think there are very few, and in fact, I don't even know of a real one, where we had such a big migration of a particular ethnicity, and then there's a dominant group, meaning Russians here, who remained in Kazakhstan afterwards. And the volume of them, 30% of population, makes it a unique situation, rather than, when we have just few people of particular kind and different minorities mixed in, minorities reclaiming. So in India, or Pakistan, or many other countries in South America, you didn't have the previous sort of hegemon remaining in large quantities within your borders. So that is very specific issue that always needs to be brought out for uniqueness of Kazakh case. So meaning that if you could understand the Kazakh case, it'll make it easier to understand many other cases which are somewhat easier. Yeah.
Okay, I think we have one last question and then we can close the meeting. So Ilhamjon Muminov, he asks about the psychological aspects of multilingualism in Kazakhstan and their association with nationality. Would you like to say anything, or is Ilhamjon? Okay, Anju, do you want to? Okay, no, he's unmuted now, so sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
And nationality, Ilhamjon, you have to clarify, do you mean ethnicity or citizenship?
Good afternoon. I would like to ask about the psychological aspects of multilingualism in Kazakhstan. I mean by nationality, by the citizenship of Kazakh people. And if you see some Kazakhs, you will wait from him is he will speak in Kazakh or Russian. It's not about ethnicity, but about citizenship.
So I can only answer this question with my own data and experience in Kazakhstan. So I think the central mechanism of what I said, the organizations become linguistically inclusive, is heavily rely on the psychological aspects. Then what we discuss, incentives, maybe the monetary incentives or whatever. So I don't know whether that's what you are asking. Is that what you're asking about my context?
Yes, of course.
Yeah, so I think the main kind of key mechanism underlying these changes in organization, it's very much of psychological aspects of language. For example, the Kazachophone language workers enacted certain practices because they felt, I think the key emotion was frustration because they felt the gap between increasing importance of the language in society and for the organizational operations and their low sense of belonging in, and not only necessarily at the workplace, but also at maybe among Russophone Russian speakers, maybe they felt low sense of belongingness. So definitely the feelings, emotion, and psychological aspect provoked their practices, social linguistic work, to nudge or to, for example, to shame someone and to encourage someone. Also, the other side, the Russophone bankers' perspective, also motivated by their emotion, because they felt that this is something important, but they can actually do without a big effort. So definitely in that context, this inclusion is hard to separate from psychological aspect. And I don't know what you mean by association of nationality, but yeah, I don't know how to answer this question.
Okay, I think he just meant that whether even if you're Russian, ethnic Russian, but you're Kazakhstani, then it would be natural to speak to you in the language, I would imagine, right?
I mean, yeah, and also that's another point in my data, because there were more or less bankers were, many of them are ethnic Kazakh who speak mainly Russian, but then there were also Russians, like ethnic Russian, who is of course Kazakhstan citizen, who speaks, and the criticism was a bit different, right? The level of criticism towards Russian. But then I also noticed for the first time in this bank that this language worker actually criticized this Russian, not speaking Kazakh. So that was a big kind of, for me, was interesting to see. So now maybe because the society has been changing so much towards more Kazakh friendly environment, maybe that's another change that now the expectation is kind of extended to other ethnic groups of Kazakhstan, among Kazakhstan citizens. I don't know, but definitely there was some association between the level of criticism and their ethnic group. So there's some kind of correlations.
All right, guys, we have 3 minutes. So Kelly, you get 30 seconds, and then Camilla can have 30 seconds, and then we'll thank Eunjoo. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. Just wondering, there seems like there's a big piece that's kind of missing from the language evolution question that we're not mentioning, and that's the mode by which much of the communication in the world today is massively changed over the last 10, 15 years with virtual, what have you. And, you know, we can look at it from, or look at the implications of that from a transliteration perspective of, okay, how do you actually, what does it mean for transcribing Kazakh or various languages? But I'm interested, have you looked at all the nature by which this mode of, why the prevailing mode of communication has changed globally? How this is affecting the nature in which ideas are conveyed within a language, i.e. Kazakh or others? And are there any kind of studies, or have you looked at this at all? Thank you.
Camilla's question as well, and then we can.
Okay, Camilla, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to make, not to ask a question, but just to make a comment, which I think is related to things we've been discussing here about nationalism, and specifically banal nationalism, which is indirect, hidden identity politics. They include not only the changes and promotion of certain language, which is the titular language, Kazakh language, but also changes in the look of the city. For example, the changes of the monuments, you know, the figures of Soviet times, their images are now removed and replaced by the figures of pre-Soviet times. The celebrations, for example, the 550th anniversary of Kazakh Khanate, for 549 years, we've been not celebrating this. And then on 550th year, we just suddenly decided to celebrate it. So we understand that this is a part of also governmental planning of what kind of messages we want to promote, and the toponymy, so the renames of different cities and streets, everything is changed, not just to celebrate Kazakh history, but also just the Kazakh linguistics, in a way that some of the words, like the word Semey, doesn't actually mean anything. And the previous name, Semipalatinsk, it had a meaning in Russian language, but we just changed the linguistic sound of it to make it sound more Kazakh. So therefore, there are so many processes, political processes happening and underpinning the development of linguistics. So I think it's not just the promotion of inclusiveness, but also very careful, hidden planning of the government to increase and empower the Kazakhness of Kazakhstan.
Okay, Eunjoo, go ahead.
Camilla, are you from Kazakhstan?
Yes, I am, and I did some research on nationalism in Kazakhstan and involved in the topic.
I would love to have a conversation with you. Really, I'm just interested in what you just told me, and I would like to discuss more if I have an opportunity. Can you please leave me your email address?
If you email me, I can put you in touch. So just you registered with me, so just send me another.
Yeah. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's I don't disagree with you completely, because the whole purpose of this revival of Kazakh language and state formation based on, but also it was necessary to have like strong identity that can replace Soviet one. So I think Kazakh was more suitable for them. So I do agree with you, but at the same time, maybe they didn't have any other alternatives or something. I don't know, but inclusion is what the government has been officially telling us, right? The whole purpose of, and also at the same time, we could also see that, as I said earlier, the Russian was never eliminated by law, and other languages are well protected. And although officially, like all the documents should be submitted only in 2 languages, not like 10 languages. So at least, I mean, the Kazakhstan government is making definitely efforts to create inclusion in a way. I would like to say, but yeah, that's.
I will jump in to say I don't think they are contradictory notions. I think what Camilla said is also true, because and you know, and it doesn't necessarily have all negative aspects or negative at all. So we do know that apart from internal political messaging, that moment you mentioned, particularly that of the 550 years, you know, was a response to an external question. We discussed that in our class, hopefully soon. But there are other factors which come in, but they have, you know, residual meaning locally. So it's quite important to look at from all aspects. If we will not understand it from one or the other, we have to look at all possible things driving the notion of why Kazakhstan want to be more Kazakh. You know, that's a different research question to you know, engage with.
Okay, it's 1:02 now, and I'm worried that the whole meeting is going to end by itself. So I wanted to thank Eunjoo, Dr. Koo, thank you very much for joining us. It's very early in the morning in Canada, so thank you so much for doing this for us. And thank you everybody for joining and listening to the talk, and the discussion was fantastic. Please do join us next Friday. We have Dr. Timur Dadubayev from Tsukuba University. He will also be joining us at some odd hour, but not so early in the morning. So thank you again, and I will connect. Just email me if you want to be connected to Eunjoo, and I can do that. All right, thank you.
Thank you so much, Eunjoo.
Thanks. Bye.